So short answer to that question. All right. Now the segment we're going to be dealing with for today, moving into next Tuesday as well. So we are exactly one lecture behind at this point now. But as you can see, we're making up ground. And so what I'm going to be speaking to you about is Dalits, Adivasis, and resistance. So two words there that you're not familiar with, Dalits and Adivasis. I might say that we're not familiar with resistance either in this country. So you're not familiar with any of these really in some sense of the term. But that's a meta-argument about resistance. That what I want to do is I want to really look at who the Dalits are, what is the nature of the Dalit movement. And in order to understand that, we have to understand something about caste, really, which is a subject for a whole course easily. So I'm going to have to be very cryptic there. The word Dalits means oppressed, broken, scattered. And the principal reading you have, and I told you that there are 4 modules, as it were, in this book, or 4 parts. The exercise of freedom and an introduction to Dalit writing, that you read any 2 of your choice. I mean, hopefully you read all 4 because it's really quite an engaging book, a real eye-opener. But it's a kind of an elementary selection, and that was a point, since you're not familiar with this literature from before. Now, before we get into that, we need to have a little bit understanding of caste. I mean, it's been argued by scholars, by anthropologists, sociologists, and historians that India is distinct in having a caste system, that there is no other country in the world which has something called a caste system. And we need to distinguish this argument about a caste system from the use of the word caste. And I'm not for the moment staking a position on whether I agree that India is distinct in having a caste system, although it is overwhelmingly the case that it's impossible to have a discussion on India without really thinking about caste in some ways. But the word caste has certainly been used in many other contexts. I mean, it was used, for example, by people writing on slavery in the American South in the 1840s, 1850s. If you read a book by George Fitzhugh, who was a defender of slavery, he speaks about the caste system in the South, in the Deep South. To his mind, that was an appropriate use of that word. And the various other forms of stratification have been described as caste. People who, it's in the same way in which the word pundits or Brahmins, I don't know how many of you have heard. Okay, I think that this. As the word Brahmins, in that sense, has had a wider currency. And again, it's interesting to note that though people speak of caste system as something that is intrinsic and indigenous to India, with an unbroken history, some argue, of 2,000-3,000 years at least, that the word caste itself is from the Portuguese. The Spanish has a comparable word, castas. It's not an Indian word at all. All right? And now the question is, what is the caste system? And generally people see it either as a form of stratification or as a form of hierarchy. The two are very different. We have to understand what the difference is very briefly between hierarchy and social stratification. Social stratification is, as the word, as the phrase indicates, any system whereby you can differentiate between people based on the strata that they belong to. So if you say, what strata of society does a person belong to, one is obviously referring to something like class here. And I think all of you will agree that even though the United States may not have what is called a caste system, it unquestionably has a class system. Although, of course, I'm well aware of the fact that there are people who've argued that class has never had the same kind of signification in America as it's had in England. So England is very often viewed as a society with a traditional class system, and one understands the class one comes from. The idea also being that in some sense that defines a person, and that historically there has been to some extent not that much mobility between classes as well. There have been lots of studies that have been shown that if you are born into a working class family in Britain, the likelihood that you will get out of that cycle, for example, in 2 generations or even 3 generations, is very small, comparatively speaking. All right. But that's stratification, system of class. Hierarchy, and one of the persons who made this argument central to an understanding of caste system in India is a French scholar by the name of Louis Dumont, who wrote a book called Homo Hierarchicus. Homo Hierarchicus. The subtitle is The Caste System and Its Implications, or something like that. So Homo Hierarchicus meaning man as a hierarchical being. Now, from his point of view, hierarchy is very different from stratification, because in a system of social stratification there is mobility. There is mobility. All of you are familiar with the story and the expression having to do with going from rags to riches. From going from rags to riches suggests, of course, a system of mobility. Yeah, there are people who are self-made millionaires or billionaires, right? And there are all these stories, real, apocryphal, legendary, of the Silicon Valley chaps who, started with a little computer in their garage, and the next thing you know, 10 years later, they own a company worth 50 billion or whatever. That would be the most dramatic instantiation. But maybe that's not the perfect story, because many of these kids, Zuckerberg and so on, they all went to Harvard. So I doubt they went to Harvard if their father had been working in a in a coal mine, and their grandfather had been working in a coal mine and so on. But nonetheless, the point is that there are thousands of such stories of mobility. And you can also go downwards, right, in a system of mobility. Now, hierarchy, the argument is that caste system cannot be understood as a form of stratification. It's a system of hierarchy. And in a hierarchy, your position is fixed at birth, right? That's the argument. I'm not suggesting my agreement with that argument. I'm giving you the argument in its classic form as expressed, for example, by Louis Dumont, among other scholars. Now, one way in which one understands the system of hierarchy is through various forms of social distancing. And we all engage in forms of distancing, but these are very dramatic forms of distancing that we're talking about. And one of these forms of distancing is the whole idea of pollution. Okay? Idea of pollution, and of course then the opposite, the idea of purity. So in general, the argument would be that the higher up you are this ladder, okay, and we're going to see if you turn to the slide over here, you'll see what are the 4 castes that are mentioned, then we'll see what the problems are. And we have to go through all of that in order to understand something about who the Dalits are, and what is this Dalit movement, and what does it mean for Dalits to begin to exercise their freedom. What have been the forms of disempowerment, disenfranchisement, discrimination against them for generations, right? But how does pollution factor in? So that if the higher up you are, the greater the need to preserve your purity, and likewise, the greater the possibility that you can be contaminated or polluted. Okay? So, this is again a general observation for you to mull over. I would argue that in most societies, what you're going to find is that taboos are very often observed more by the middle class and less so by the upper class and the lower class. For example, in India, just give you a simple illustration of that. I remember a conversation with an aunt of mine, and she saw me smoking in my early 20s. She had never seen me smoking, and she was horrified. And why was she horrified? Because I asked her, she said, well, Gentlemen don't smoke. That was the oddest explanation you might think. I can think of 1,000 reasons. She could have said, well, it's going to kill you, or you'll end up with lung cancer, but gentlemen don't smoke or drink. Really? Gentlemen don't? I thought that's all they do, I told her. But in any case, you see, the point was that she's very middle class, and in the working class, it's very common for women to smoke. Very common. They might even smoke the hookah. And if you're upper class, they smoke and they drink if they want to, as they please. It's in the middle class that the restrictions are greater, right? Now that might be one way to think about notions of distancing, pollution, all of that. But here I'm going to give you a different framework, because that's a framework which goes back to the Smritis, that is these scriptures and law books. So there is a law book written by a man called Manu. The book is called Manu Smriti, the laws of Manu. It's dated to approximately 200 CE, 200 of the Common Era, so let's say about 1800 years old. And without getting into a discussion of how important that book has been, some people think it's been the decisive law book. I think it's a completely mistaken view. But that's well outside the purview of what we need to think about. Well, one of the things that Manu Smriti says, however, is that when a Shudra is walking down the street, okay, he needs to announce his presence so that a Brahmin can hear him coming. So he can announce his presence by ringing a bell. Because if he doesn't announce his presence, and say the Brahmin is walking and is absorbed, and then the Dalit passes by, the Brahmin gets polluted. He could get polluted even if the shadow of this man falls on him. And then if he gets polluted, then what does he have to do? Then he has to go home, and then he has to take off his clothes, take a bath, do some rituals, etc., etc. All right? That's, and incidentally, pardon the anecdote, but you'll see again how this works even in modern times. About 15 years ago, a law firm called me up in LA, and they said, we're looking for an expert in Indian history and religion, and we were referred to you. I said, well, what can I do for you? Long story short, some Hindu had gone to Taco Bell, had asked for a vegetarian or chicken taco, for whatever it was. He got a beef taco. And he bit into it, and then realized to his shock he had bitten into a beef taco. And you're a Hindu, not supposed to eat beef. So he said he was outraged. So he went to the counter, and they gave him a coupon for 2 free tacos. You know how customer service works, right? Yeah? And he was furious. And he called up a law firm, and then he explained to them that he was a Hindu. He had been he had eaten beef mistakenly, and he had been polluted. So he asked for compensation of $100,000. The law firm called me, and they said, we think this guy's completely bogus. We don't understand what he's saying. He's saying he has to go back to India to a lake called Pushkar, which is a holy lake, and he has to circumambulate that lake 10 times, and then he has to feed 1,000 pandits, and he's charging money for feeding 1,000 pandits, and all of that, and this sounds like bullshit to us, you know, and can you weigh in on this matter? Okay, I'm serious. That was a law case. All right, so these things matter. Yeah, no, I can't tell you the end. Of course not. You have to be in suspense for a while. You know, maybe over coffee. All right. So now, you see what the issue here is, that these are rules of pollution, and if you are low down the ladder, you can't get contaminated, because you contaminate others. You yourself cannot get contaminated. That's one way to understand. Okay? I'll have to have a lot of territory to cover. But I'm saying that you can think of it in a general fashion, because, look, our task is not only to understand the phenomenon in India, but we have to, at the same time, endeavor to make it less exotic. Because this Manu Smriti thing I've told you, some of you must be thinking to yourself, that's really bizarre. You know, it's really exotic, this whole idea of the shadow falling in him. But you are all familiar with ideas of pollution and contamination. How often did black people and white people eat together? I asked a colleague of mine who is a historian, who is a specialist in African American history, that. And she said she can't find any literature on it. And I said, I want to know, how often did they actually eat together? These are forms of distancing. I'm not trying to diminish the extent of the problem in India, but I'm trying to make it less exotic. That's an important intellectual task for us when we try to study another culture, right? So now, when we start looking, and this is what I mean by commensality, who eats with who and who doesn't. So when you're looking at the history of the Sikhs, very briefly, one of the most extraordinary things about the Sikhs, and you can see that in any Sikh Gurdwara. Gurdwara is their house of worship. So they don't call it a church or a temple, it's called a Gurdwara, literally door to the Guru. If you go to a Gurdwara, they have an institution which the Sikhs founded. It's called a langar. A langar is a communal meal. Why it was so radical was that even today, if you go to a Gurdwara, everyone will sit in rows. It doesn't matter who you are. Whether you're a millionaire, a beggar, Indian, no questions asked. I took my children to a langar in Delhi at a Gurdwara, and they were astonished because they were like 500, and everyone's fed free. There's no money ever taken. But the whole idea was they don't ask you who you are, what's your caste, because the Sikhs, that was one of the things they attempted to do when the religion was instituted. Because the problem with the Hindus was there are billions of people they can't eat with. You can't eat. If you read an oral history of the partition, 1947 partition that we have talked about by Urvashi Bhutalia called The Other Side of Silence. So many of the people that she's interviewing, the Muslims, some of the Muslims say, one of the reasons the partitions happened is because the Hindus never ate with us. And we sort of felt this. Of course, what they didn't understand was that many of the Hindus didn't eat with other Hindus. Because within the Hindus themselves, there are all of these forms of stratification, So this is what commensality means, who you eat with, who you don't, what are the rituals and protocols of eating. And this is one of the ways in which one can begin to understand these forms of distancing and how there have been attempts to collapse these forms of distancing. Now, so what are the castes that we're talking about? So typically, a book will tell you there are 4 castes. Brahmins, who are the Pandits, the priests, in hierarchical order from top to bottom. Pandits, priests, knowledge brokers, these are the sacred texts and other kinds of literature too were all transmitted through the oral tradition for centuries before they were written down. Yeah? And it was the Brahmins who would retain these and pass them down. I say priests because this is Pandits would be the better word, that's a Christian category sort of priests, but you understand. Right? These are the people who work at temples, who officiate over the rituals, all the important rites of passage in a person's life, birth, so forth and so on, marriage, having grandchildren, etc. Kshatriyas, warriors. What's their occupation? Warriors, rulers, administrators, high-level administrators. The Brahmins and the Kshatriyas are very often seen as constituting a pair because the Brahmins exercise spiritual power and the Kshatriyas exercise power in the temporal world, right? So very often they're seen as constituting a pair. Then you have the Vaishyas, people who would be traders, merchants, shopkeepers. Mohandas Gandhi was a Vaishya, was born a Gujarati Banya. Banya is almost a pejorative word, but means basically, in this case, someone who's a grocer, actually. Ancestrally, that's what they would have been. Very often, you can tell by an Indian name, okay, what caste that person comes from, very often. And what the ancestral profession of that person's would have been, okay? And then you have the Shudras. So I've put sanitation workers. I'm using a modern Western category. It's not like they come on these huge trucks like they do here, you know, sanitation workers. But these are people who are dealing with doing the dirtiest, what was considered the dirtiest, most polluting work. That now you go back to that idea of pollution I was talking about, the most polluting work. So for example, working with the hide of dead animals, particularly the cow, that was considered very, very polluting. You know, people working as butchers, people removing feces, you know, what was all over the world. Until the flush toilet really came into existence, what did people do? I know it's not a very pleasant subject to talk about, obviously, but you should read accounts of what they did in London and what they did in Edo. Edo is Tokyo, right? I mean, they literally threw it from their bedroom window very often down into the streets. You know, what do you do with these products, right? So they're basically, these people did the work of scavenging. They still do it, many of them. They work with the hide of cattle. They were what you call sanitation workers and landless laborers. I've highlighted landless because we're going to look at the question of land later on. Now, these are the four castes. However, it doesn't tell us very much. And I'll give you an illustration once again. Why it doesn't tell us very much about how caste works on the ground. So I'm making a distinction now that you need to keep in mind. That there is something to be said about the textbook view. This is a textbook view. You open a text, whether it's Manusmriti or whether it's a modern work of anthropology, it'll tell you these are the castes. That's a textbook view. This is the hierarchy. Okay? But then there is the view from the ground, which could be very, very different. How could it be very different? Let's take two illustrations, one at a smaller level and one at a macro level. When I was growing up in Delhi, so I would ride the DTC bus, Delhi Transport Corporation, intended for 60 people, more likely to have 200 people packed into it. 200. And I'm telling you, there's not room to move an elbow in some of these. It's packed. Now, do you suppose that, so I'm being jostled in the crowd and constantly rubbing my head and shoulders and everything with people all around me. You know, the bus swerves a little bit, everybody lurches and falls. So do you suppose every time I ask, are you a Shudra or not? You know, because, hey, you know, I'm supposed to keep 50 feet from you, and now I'm not even able to keep 5 inches from you. Forget about 50 feet. Of course not. I mean, you know, people in the buses don't go around asking everybody, are you a Brahmin or a Shudra or a Vaishya or whatever, right? No. Now, in other words, so what is the textbook view really doing? How is it really helping us understand these rules of pollution and contamination? I'm not saying they don't exist. I myself told you in this class 3 weeks ago that if you go to village India, there are still villages where if there is one single well, the Dalits may not be permitted to draw water from that well. Now you understand why. Because if they draw water from that well, they have effectively contaminated the whole source of water. They polluted it. So they may have to go 10 kilometers away where the next well is. Okay? But nonetheless, that's village India. What happens here? People are using the same facilities. Doesn't matter who you are. Let's take it at the historical level, macro level. There is no question that there are ruling dynasties in India that were Shudra dynasties. Plenty of evidence. Plenty of evidence. What they may have to do if a Shudra dynasty comes into power, because they're not supposed to be ruling, is they have to legitimize themselves. Well, what would they do? They would hire the Brahmins. The Brahmins would rewrite their genealogy and say, oh, you are descended from the great line of the kings of Ram or whoever. Right? So the system was constantly being subverted. This supposition that it was ironclad, there was never any movement, simply cannot be borne out. That's what I'm suggesting to you. Okay? Now the question is, so then who are the Dalits? Because if you read the Encyclopedia Britannica article, for example, it'll tell you that the Dalits are outside the caste system. They're outside the caste system. That's one way to understand it, that they're so low that they're not even the Shudras. And there's a lot of discussion about who the Dalits are, whether they should be viewed as the lowest of the Shudras, because, by the way, within all of these there are pecking orders. There are many different kinds of Brahmins. And this is where we have to get into Jati, because the really operative word here is the word Jati. Varna is these four castes, the four varnas. So instead of using the Spanish Portuguese word castas, we use the Indian Sanskritic word, which is varna, which means color, literally. Okay, sometimes translated as occupation. The system is occupation based, but the word is color. So what is really operative on the ground is the system of Jati. Now there are thousands of Jatis. And if you had to use an English word, easiest would be subcaste. There are thousands of Jatis, and they can be new Jatis. All right? They can be new Jatis. I mean, this may sound a little odd to you this way, but let's say over a period of 2 generations, you have a Jati of computer scientists, computer programmers. Couldn't have existed in the 19th century. I think you would agree with that. But yes, they could be a Jati, if it's occupation-based. And then the Jati might have its own Puranas, its own histories, so to speak. So what is operative on the ground is a system that we might describe as Jatis. Okay? Then we still have to go back to the questions. So what then is, who then are the Dalits? Now there are lots of accounts. Sometimes they're referred to as a fifth caste, sometimes they're simply referred to as outcasts or as being outside the system. They're also known as AKA Panchamas, which is the fifth, untouchables. And we'll have to go back to that word, because the legislation that was passed in India in the aftermath of independence spoke about the elimination of untouchability. That's why you need to know the word. It's not politically correct to use that word at all today. Okay, but but the legislation does not talk about rights of Dalits. The Constitution says nothing about the rights of Dalits. It says something about the rights of scheduled castes, which is the official terminology for these people. They're also scheduled tribes. They're called scheduled because they are listed in a appendix or schedule to the Constitution, as it were. So it's a document which enumerates these groups of people who have been historically disadvantaged and therefore are now deserving of recompense by the government of India in some fashion or the other, or by state governments, by the state, that is. Okay? But we still go back, right? And we'll get back to the question of who is what fifth caste. So one theory, because my mandate here is not to give you a historical account of how they came into being and all of that. That's a very long, complicated question. But you need to have a little bit idea, right? So one account that is very plausible is an account which requires an understanding of marriage patterns, right? And in order to understand that, we need to understand endogamy and hypergamy. Hypergamy is very simple. It's prevalent in every society, whether people know it or not. And what is it? Hypergamy is basically women who marry upwards. Everywhere in the world you see that. Women marry upwards because usually the children from that marriage acquire the status of the father. And that's why they marry upwards. You know? And here in an American class society, you'll see it as well. Highly educated women usually will be married to men who are as highly educated as them, if not more educated than them. But of course, highly educated men did not always marry highly educated women. In fact, the norm until quite recently, because women weren't even highly educated. All the professors of the previous generation, most of their wives didn't work at all. The women had a bachelor's degree maybe at most. The men had doctorates. I can give you thousands of instances going across the board. Professions, all of that. So that's hypergamy, is women marry upwards. In the caste system, a Shudra woman or a Vaishya woman marries a Brahmin man. The children acquire the status of the father. Right? Now, the Panchamas, it's the reverse. It was forbidden. A Brahmin woman marries a Shudra man, she's condemning her children to Shudra status because they acquire the status of their father. And it was frowned upon. Right? So one account, there are lots of accounts. One account is that this fifth caste or Panchamas arose out of this. The general way to understand is that it arose out of a differentiation from within the ranks of the Shudras, those who became the lowest of the low. Right? Whatever the account, it's not important that we agree on that. What is important, to recapitulate before we now get into the Dalits, okay? What is important is to understand that there is a textbook view of caste which does not necessarily correspond to the reality on the ground, doesn't tell you the view from the ground, and that's what Varna versus Jati helps us to do. Varna is a textbook view, Jatis explain how these things work on the ground. And secondly, that whatever the historical narrative of who the Dalits are and how they came about, or how they came about, what their origin is, what's important is that they have been viewed as the lowest of the low. Right? And they do work. The best way to understand it is they do work that is contaminating or polluting. All right? Which doesn't mean that's the only work they do. And that's why I said, for example, they work as landless laborers as well. In Indian hospitals, I'm talking about today, I'm not talking about 50 years ago. In hospitals, if you did an anthropological study of who are the people who take urine samples, because you see, any substance from the body is polluting. Yeah? So feces, urine, blood, spit, all of that, right? Spittle, all of that. It's polluting. Mucus. And so who are the people who work collecting these samples of blood? It's very often going to be the Dalits. It's just a fact. I mean, nobody wants to talk about it, but it is. Of course, you could make the argument, some people have made the argument, if you paid a Brahmin, let's say that doing that work, you earned as much money as a neurosurgeon, the Brahmins would happily do that work. And I think that's actually the case. But that's a different matter, once again. I think very often the matter of economic rewards is not unimportant in how one looks at this. And it's important only because it helps to break down this idea that this is a strictly ideological matter, not necessarily. All right. So those are the general things you need to keep in mind. Now you know what kind of work they do. So what does it mean? What it means is that over a long period of time, the standard account is that they have been discriminated against. And there have been various forms of distancing. So if you go to an Indian city, you will find that there were patterns of segregation in the housing. And you could tell from the colors of the roof which caste group that person belonged to. And usually it would be segregated, that they would all be in that part, just like housing has been segregated here along racial lines, and still is, largely. Right? That would be one way to look at it. There was segregation in housing, obviously, segregation in profession, and obviously a much lower class status as well. So if there were lower caste and lower class usually went together. Not always, because the Brahmins were upper caste, but they did not get much remuneration for the work that they did. The idea partly being that if you're a Brahmin and you're interacting with the gods, so to speak, there's enough spiritual recompense. You know, what does the Pope need money for anyhow, right? That sort of thing. They might need other things, but not money. So that's something. The caste and class are congruent often, but not always. And these forms of discrimination were sought to be ameliorated in different ways. Now, we get into the Adivasis, and then I'm going to come back to the Dalits, because usually no one talks about the Adivasis, and there is some overlap, not entirely, but there's some overlap. Right? So Adivasis are Adi, original, first, prefix, and Vasi is a dweller, inhabitant. Okay? So original dwellers, that is what you might view as the original population. Again, we won't get into that, but people who, if you had to use the English translation, would be viewed as aboriginals or tribal population. That would be in India. They don't use the word aboriginal really. You know, in Australia, of course, you would speak about the aboriginals. In India, you would speak about the tribal population, what some people call the fourth world. Now, before I get into their worldview, very briefly, why am I bringing this in? Because let's look at the overlap. An interesting overlap, which will explain to you why, even though we should look at Dalits as distinct and the Adivasis as distinct, there are many cases of their histories overlapping. And they may, of course, be both in some ways at the same time. What would that illustration be? The consumption of beef. See, one of the ways, of course, the flesh of animals is polluting. Okay, but that's not to say that all Brahmins are vegetarians. Completely erroneous. Right? There are Brahmins who are vegetarians. The likelihood that someone at the lowest strata is vegetarian is zero, unless they have become a vegan recently in India for some reason, or something like that, you know, some global consciousness about the benefits of being vegetarian and all of that. But I'm saying historically, if you're a person of the lowest caste, no, because one thing that was available to them when there was a shortage of food supply was the flesh of the cow. The Hindus wouldn't touch it, no matter what happened. If you had shortage of food, they wouldn't touch that. But they have no problem. Right? Now the Adivasis also ate beef. And by the way, in the current, I wish I could give you a whole lecture on that. It would be really very interesting for you to hear it, but not have time, which is the politics of vegetarianism. You see, one of the problems with the Hindutva, the Hindu right attack on various people whom they declare as anti-national, on Dalits and Muslims and intellectuals, you know, and there have been many instances, if you ever read Indian newspapers the last 3-4 years, that a group of people were carrying cattle, you know, on their truck, and they were suddenly pounced upon by a bunch of Hindus who said, oh, you're taking the cow to be slaughtered, and they killed the person because the cow is not meant to be cow is meant to be revered, and they were furious at what these Muslims or Dalits were doing. Right? What is important is that beef is one of the most important sources of protein for these people. And I think that actually whatever ideological reason one might have for this or that, you have to factor in things like that when you look at the attack on people who are eating beef. Right? It is. So there's actually a very serious problem that you're cutting out because there's not much else, and you see the price is relatively low. It's low because Hindus won't consume it. All right? So now what's important here is that this is where you see the overlap. That many of the hill tribes, especially the Aboriginal people in India, during colonial times, for example, when this whole classification started, what caste are you? Do you belong to a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe? Are you a tribal, etc., etc.? These forms of classification go back to colonial India. That the colonial ethnographers often confused many of the tribals for Dalits, because these were people who ate beef. Right? And the overlap here is that the eating of beef is actually quite common. There's no problem that tribal groups very often have. It is becoming a problem. We'll explain that later on, the whole process of Sanskritization, which I'll get into later on. All right? Now, the worldview of tribals is important to understand. And one way to understand them, it's, for example, when you look at Native American groups. When we look at Native Americans, I think one thing you probably will agree with, I think, is that by and large, they are really invisible. You can pass your whole life in this country and not ever know that you've spoken to one, okay, or you've spent time with them, or you know anything of their history. They have become more or less invisible, Right? Okay? And in some ways, that is really the position of tribal people in India too. When you think about, well, what place do they really have? And we're not speaking about a minuscule number of people. I hope you understand that. I mean, I'm speaking about, if you're looking at the tribal population of India, it's something in the neighborhood of 150 million. That's astronomical. Okay? I mean, huge numbers that we're really talking about. And we're not talking about one tribal group, obviously. We're talking about lots of different tribal groups. And the tribe, and their different histories there. So, if there happens to be someone here who's really well informed, you'll have to pardon me, because here I have to obviously generalize. But the histories of the Santals and the Bhils, and numerous other tribal communities, it can vary quite a bit. Their relationship to Hindus, to caste society, their relationship to the colonial state, there can be considerable differences. Nonetheless, we can say that, we can speak about the worldview of tribals. Very often when you look at tribal art, no matter which part of India it's come from, whether it's from Orissa or let's say from Chhattisgarh in central India, many of the things are very common. The kinds of material they work with. You will find, for example, that their notion of art has nothing to do with the reproduction of art for sale. I recently, last year, had invited a person who comes from the Meena community, and this person showed me, well, this is a person who comes from a tribal group but is an artist and also speaks English. And he showed me the work that their women have done. Women are very important in these tribal communities, because a lot of the work is done around the house, decorating the house, the walls of the house, which all makes sense, because after all, you want your house to look nice, right? So there's an organic relationship with that art, and this art is not meant for reproduction and for sale. And immediately what happens is someone from Delhi, some art collector comes from Delhi or New York, and they see it. The first thing they think about is, how do I get this to the market? How come this man isn't making money? He should be making money. That's the view that the metropole brings to the tribal world. So for them, this is not a consideration. The distinctions between private and public really don't make much sense. And one of the things that's been argued about the tribal population is, for example, their views of sexuality are quite different. The mores of sexuality are quite different. The women have a certain kind of sexual freedom, for example. It may be regulated in some ways, but the question is whether their sexual freedom is regulated any more than the sexual freedom of the men. Okay? But they may have a certain kind of sexual freedom which would be completely unknown to a lower middle class Hindu family or Muslim family in India or Pakistan, for example. Right? So when we talk about the worldview, we can look at hundreds of such things, but I've given you one illustration in some greater detail. That is, for example, their relationship to art, the fact that they don't really think about the market economy. Because we do have to think about, if there are 150 million tribals, so when the state has all these development agendas we want to develop, what does it mean to develop them? I don't know if anyone here remembers the incident that was reported in all the newspapers of the world, where a Christian missionary, an American Christian missionary, went to the Andaman Islands. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. A few months ago, he was trying to, he wanted to bring, Christianity, the word of Jesus Christ, to these poor, benighted folks. And he was kind of warned, you don't mess around with these people. But no, he had a mission to serve, and they shot an arrow into him, and he died. I don't think there were too many people who were shedding tears except members of his church back there, because they were thinking, what makes people think that you can just go and develop them what? So that they learn to use guns, right? Or build atomic weapons or whatever it is. Right? What does that mean? I'm putting it in somewhat crass terms, but you understand, right? That the question here is, what is their place in modern India? How does one think about their place? And the policy is always about what to do with them. Well, what is there to do with them? Why should it be framed in that way? But you see, where we have the impulse that we think, well, they need to be brought the benefits of modern civilization, such as it might be. So that's the larger scheme that you have to think about. Now, one of the ways in which one thinks about the tribals and what the policy, because of course there are serious questions about what is the policy of the government of India towards these tribals. And by the way, the general policy, there's been a kind of an ambivalence, because there are people, I don't think of the government of India as the most enlightened organ of opinion in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but surprisingly there are people in the ministry having to do with tribal welfare, and this all really goes back to several decades, because they were extraordinarily interesting and sensitive people who were thinking about these questions, including an Englishman who is kind of one of the who married a tribal woman and lived in India the rest of his life, Verrier Elvin, really an extraordinary person. Much of what we know about some parts of tribal India really go back to him, and then of course there's been a lot of work done since then. But one thing that became very clear, if you look at the ministry in India that supervises tribal populations, is that there is a real debate going on there. There are people in the ministry who do not take the view that these people really need to be simply brought within the orbit of development. And you've already heard my critique of development, right? And they may not have as far-reaching a critique, but what they do understand is that that development in the ordinary sense of the term has been extremely detrimental to most of these groups, all right? One thing that is very critical is their relationship to the land. And in order to understand that, so I'm also prefiguring a few things here, but when we look at the relationship to the land, one of the things that we have to really understand is that land, both in Adivasi communities, certainly in Adivasi communities and in Dalit communities, to the extent that Dalit communities have land, land has very often been held in common. Now, when a developer comes, or when somebody tries to come and appropriate land, there's a real problem there. One of the problems is that many of these people don't have a title deed to the land. So they say, okay, so you were saying that this has been part of the communal property of your community for 200 years, or where's the title deed? Well, no, they don't have a title deed. They don't know what a title deed is very often. And so, of course, there are social activists and human rights activists who've been working with these communities to try to educate them about a title deed and so forth. But you see, all of this only becomes important when you think of land as something that can be alienated. You know what alienated in this sense means? Something that can be sold and purchased, right? In other words, land becomes another commodity which part of the market economy. And this is not typically how they've looked at the land at all, which has also meant that there has been, and this is not a form of romanticization, there's quite a lot of literature that shows that there has been a way in which these tribal communities have learned to live with the land, you see, not just on the land, but on the land, with the land, and therefore it means that there is obviously, to a much greater degree than there is in our kinds of communities, there is a much more what we might call ecologically friendly and sensitive use of the products of the land, right? So the tribal communities are very unlikely to engage, for example, in what you might describe as market economy agriculture, okay? Very, very unlikely. They tend to generally grow for themselves or for the local market within. The modern view of land really is the colonial view of land, particularly when it's occupied by tribals, which is that they had only one thing that they thought about, the colonial state, when it came to tribal land. And that's really what modern corporations, the one thing they think about, which is extraction. That these people don't know what to do with the land, and they sit on top of land that might be valuable, particularly land that is extremely wealthy in mineral resources. The world over, by the way, if you look at Burma as a very good example, we're not talking about Burma very much in this course at all, although it's really in that area. But in Myanmar, as it's known, or Burma, the old name, there are a great many tribal communities, and nearly all of them sit atop enormous mineral reserves. And that is one of the reasons why everyone is interested in making inroads into those areas. It's not because for them, the tribals are just an obstacle. They're just an obstacle. They're just something that needs to be removed. Because fundamentally the policy, the worldview has to do with extraction. This was not historically how the colonial state saw the land of poor people, because there it was not a question of extraction. There it was simply a question that these people don't make enough use of the land. They don't know how to make it fertile enough. Okay? That was a difference. So they were still thinking of agriculture and production. In the case of tribal lands occupied by tribal communities, the view is not one that, hey, they should put it to good agricultural use. The view rather is one of extraction. We need to extract mineral ores from there, for example. All right? So when you're thinking about the tribal world in India, I'm suggesting that these are some of the considerations that come in mind, and there is a set of very difficult questions which have to do with how the interests of tribal peoples could be advanced. Okay? So, now, the question for us, and then remaining time I'm going to spend will be on ameliorative measures taken to address the problem of discrimination. And then we're going to move, which I won't be able to do today, but as I'd already indicated before, on Tuesday, I'm also going to move into histories of resistance by Dalits and Adivasis. So first set of considerations is the legal measures taken to advance Dalit rights. Okay? And as a little, so if you did your reading from this, from the modules, you know that there are, it's a mix of different kinds of, there's some poetry, there's memoirs, there's short stories, and some of the things that I've spoken to you about, you would have noticed that there are actually stories which touch on these matters. For example, there's a story which is called New Custom. Did anybody here read it? And yeah, did anybody? So this is a story where a man goes to a place, and it's on page 129. Even if you didn't read this module, I would read this story. You have the PDF of the book. Okay, it's the book. It's called New Custom. This man goes to a place, and he goes to a chai shop, tea shop. Okay, and he orders a cup of tea. The guy who runs this tea shop, he enters into a conversation with him. He is quite certain that this man has arrived because there is the local landlord or whoever it is, someone in that family is about to get married off. And this, if you appear at this obscure, out-of-the-way place, what could be the reason for that? The only reason is that you're about to go to the marriage of this person, who lives close by, who is a big shot in that area. Well, to cut a long story short, towards the end, he finds out that this person to whom he has been serving tea and to whom he has served this tea is a Dalit. Okay. Now remember this whole thing about contamination, pollution, and all of that, right? So page 135, they have this little conversation. Then this shopkeeper becomes aware of what he's done. So I'll just read it out for you. You've got it wrong somehow. There was harshness, conviction, and authority in the shopkeeper's voice. Not just Dharam Singh Ji. I know the entire village. There must be a mix-up. Doesn't he work in the waterworks department? The man got irritated. Oh, no. You're talking about Dharam Harijan, the operator. The shopkeeper slapped his forehead. As if there could be a wedding in the village without my knowing. The shopkeeper's voice was distant and rude. How much do I owe you? Noting the shift in the shopkeeper's tone, the man pulled out a 100-rupee note. 3 rupees, but brother, first wash the glass. This in the shopkeeper's rudest tone yet. Why? The man felt as though a bucket of water had been dumped on him. His own voice seemed to come from the bottom of a well. Why? This is the custom of the village, the shopkeeper shouted for any bystander to hear. A rise in status does not put an end to custom. You'll understand why I'm reading this story before I begin the legal section here. The man stepped down from the stall. He suddenly thought of his father. He saw the naked man lying in the distance. He saw the puppies wrestling, etc. What's going on, Banwari? A face from the crowd tossed out the question. See, Chaudhry, I had taken him to be a good man. It's not as if it's written on someone's forehead who is what. He could have told me at the outset that he has come to Dharma Harijan's place. Harijan is the word that Gandhi had coined for the untouchables. It literally means children of God. The Dalits don't want to use it at all. They thought it was patronizing, condescending. But this man, so he says, see, because there are 3 different people by the name of Dharma, and so he had said, I'd come to this, for this purpose. He thought, you've come for the wedding of Dharma Singh's son. Well, he had come for Dharma Harijan. Okay? There was some hesitation among the bystanders when they saw the man's clothing and impressive stature. Now, this man doesn't look like a Dalit. Upward mobility. He's wearing westernized clothes, probably. He's looking smart, The shopkeeper's next question was meant to clinch the issue. Should I serve you tea now in a Harijan glass? And if I hadn't told you, under the weight of the insult, the words emerged with difficulty. If you hadn't said anything, the sin would have been on you. You don't drink from a cup once you've spotted a fly in it. The shopkeeper shouted, raising his hands. Why are you being stubborn, brother? Just wash it. This is the custom here. A man came forward. Why make an issue of it? Another asked. Do you wash it too? He then said, the man who's being asked to wash. He turned towards the voice and asked haughtily, why should I? The man was offended. So then why should I? Came the retort. He's going to get thrashed, etc. How much for this glass? His jaw clenched in anger. Why? The shopkeeper was surprised. Tell me how much it is. His 20 rupees. The shopkeeper inflated the price. Take this. He thrust the 100-rupee note at the shopkeeper. The father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, was smiling on the note. Gandhi is on every banknote, right? Wrapped in a shawl. The shopkeeper quickly grabbed the money. Change. His eyebrows were stretched taut. The man took the change from the shopkeeper, put it in his pocket. Picking up the glass, he smashed it. The platform against the chabutra, that's the platform under the trees on which the village folk sat for tea and chit-chat, and shards of glass flew in all directions. The man bent down, picked up his suitcase, and started towards the village. A smile bloomed on the shopkeeper's face, a smile not unlike Gandhiji's on the note. Okay? Now, before we enter into this, we have to bear in mind, and it's a point I've made before, but now it's worth reiterating, that you can have the most progressive legislation, and it may not make an iota of difference, which is not an argument for not having the legislation, but it's an argument for understanding how legislation works and doesn't work, how sometimes it obfuscates certain things, right? That's what we have to think about. What we also have to think about is the fact that you cannot simply on the basis of physical anthropology, you look at a person and say, this person's a Dalit. No, of course you can't do that. And what also needs to be understood is that a person may elevate his or her status, a person who's a Dalit. Dalit plays a lottery, and suddenly the Dalit wins the jackpot, 10 million rupees. So what happens? Does the Dalit become someone else? And in the context of the village, the answer is no. A Dalit is a Dalit. That's one reason why Dalits might flee to the city. Because when you get to the city, where there are 20 million people or 10 million people, you're anonymous. You really are. There's this wonderful Hindi film, 1989, called Satya. You ever get a chance to see it? Satya, which the word means truth. 1989 Bollywood film. And it begins with this camera on the top, and slowly it zooms down into a person who's one of thousands, because this person has entered Bombay or Mumbai from the village. Right? You individuate the person, one out of thousands. Where did he come from? What's his ancestral profession? What's the name of his father? You don't know any of that. You won't know that at all in the film. In the village, it's impossible to escape your history. People know who you are. They know who your father is, what the ancestral profession was. Right? So you can try to have upward mobility for yourself, and legislation may assist you in that. But it may not be the roadway to getting accepted by everyone in that society. Now there was colonial era legislation. Colonial era not necessarily introduced by the state, or if introduced by the state, introduced willingly. It was at the behest of social groups, really. An instance of that was the Madras Removal of Civil Disabilities Act of 1938. But the bulk of the legislation that we're speaking about really comes about with the creation of the Indian Constitution. And Article 17 of the Indian Constitution says untouchability is abolished and its practice in any form is forbidden. Those are the exact words. There's no qualification. It doesn't hedge it. Right? It's practice in any form. And the practice of untouchability means, what does it mean? It means that I may not render someone an untouchable by my practices. That if someone came to me, I would be rendering that person untouchable, so to speak, treating that person, if I determined that the person was an untouchable, by then refusing to serve that person. Okay? Of course, it's like legislation in this country, that that's what the courts are there for. Right? The Constitution will give you something in 10 lines, and then courts for 200 years have had thousands of cases trying to interpret that in different contexts. Because in any form, so A comes to me and I refuse to serve. Well, that seems to be because I've determined the person as a Dalit. Well, that's a clear case of what would seem to be the practice of untouchability. Right? But what happens when that person comes to me and I have put aside 5 glasses, and the cheapest glass is the one I use for Dalits? By the way, it's common in Indian homes. Very common. Very, very common. All middle-class homes almost. That, because all Indian middle-class homes, and same thing in Pakistan, they have servants, as they're called there, okay? Right? And, people who, it could be a live-in servant, it could be someone who comes in the morning and leaves at 8 in the evening, or comes for 2 hours, whatever, but, someone who's the housekeeper, maid, all of that. And the maid, the housekeeper, they do not eat and drink from your kitchenware. There's a separate set of utensils for them, always. And even when in the hot weather, the courier guy comes with a delivery, and so they might say, hey, do you mind if I get a glass of water? You say, sure, no, you take it out of your fridge, a nice cold glass of water. But there's a separate glass for that. Now, is that, so of course, if it says untouchability is abolished and its practice in any form is forbidden. So this would be now, right? I mean, would this be discrimination or not? It's not like you're refusing to serve that person, but you put aside a separate, you've created a differentiation. Right? That could be a complicated case, but we don't need to look at the complicated case. We can say this is what the law says. Untouchability is abolished, that you cannot deny anyone their rights, on their social, cultural, political rights, on the grounds of they being Dalits or untouchables. Notice it doesn't say untouchability is abolished and or practice of discrimination against Dalits. That's why I said the word Dalits doesn't appear in the Constitution. You have to understand that, all right? Untouchability Offences Act. Once you have a constitutional prohibition, as in the case of the United States, you have the Constitution, but then you've got millions of state statutes about all kinds of things. And Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, those are the mega ones, and there are thousands of smaller ones, because you obviously need other pieces of legislation to keep on making things more clear as well. Untouchability Offences Act 1955 imposes penalties upon those preventing the enjoyment, okay, upon those who are prevented and those who prevent the enjoyment by people, by Dalits, of their rights on the grounds of their being a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe person. Right? And then, just to give you another piece of legislation, the act that was passed in 1989, very interesting and very complicated. Scheduled Castes and Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act. So prevention of atrocities against scheduled tribes and castes, 1989. What is unusual about this piece of legislation? What is unusual about this piece of legislation is that constitutionally it's mandated, really, the courts have declared it to be the case as well, that if a complaint is lodged under this act, a person files a complaint. Let's say I'm a Dalit, I don't get served, okay, at a restaurant. I go to the cops and file a complaint and say that the Constitution says I cannot be discriminated against, this person is refusing to serve me food because I'm a Dalit. Right? Now there could be any number of pieces of legislation. Remember that the Constitution is not a piece of legislation in the ordinary sense. Right? It establishes the norms. Then there are pieces of legislation and there could be hundreds of them. So the difference is that if the complaint is lodged against this, under this act, and it can only be lodged if the police are able to make a determination that the person who has been discriminated against, that his or her community is listed on that schedule. You could be a person from a community that's not listed. And if you lodge, so the person who lodges a complaint, what happens? They don't actually know whether their community is listed or not. I can give you an illustration. Okay? And that illustration is, I live in a kind of a complex in Delhi, when I go back there. The guy underneath me, no exaggeration, is really like a mafia man. I mean, he's like the local hooligan. Okay, you can't really mess around with him, and he tries to make life miserable, particularly for people like me, since I'm on top and I live in America, so he just can't, you know, I'm like a prey for him if he can. Okay, now so, without giving you all the details, so there's a woman who works there at my home. She maintains the place, and he kind of harasses her. So, but she's illiterate. She doesn't know what to do. And she goes to the cops, they're not going to listen to him. They say, screw off. Part of the language, that's what they'll say. You know, they're not interested. Okay? Whereas this guy is a muscle man, he's got connections with the police and all of that. However, so I spoke to a lawyer, he said, if she lodges a complaint under this act, then the police have to take down the complaint and investigate it. It's required. It's constitutionally mandated. The question is she a scheduled caste or tribe? I asked her. She said she had no idea. That I had to do the research. Figure out, well, you know, does she belong to that? Because if she, then I could say, okay, now I've got you, right? Turned out, much to my disappointment, if I may put it this way, if I could take a narrow jaundiced view for the moment, that she's not listed. Okay, her community is not listed. But this is the difference between this piece of legislation. Right? That now it is misused. How is it misused? You want to settle scores with someone, yeah? Or you want to implicate someone. What do? You file a complaint that is not legitimate under this particular act. So, in other words, I'm not a member of this scheduled caste and tribe, and I know that, and I go file a complaint. And somehow I'm able to get the police to accept the complaint. And the complaint has nothing to do with my discrimination under this provisions of this act. But then what happens? The police say, oh, complaint has been filed against you, and you know what? It's a non-bailable offense. The minute the complaint is filed and accepted, you get hauled. And it's into jail, and it's a non-bailable offense until it's adjudicated. That's the important thing. It's non-bailable. You can't get bail. So you see, every time you introduce a very progressive piece of legislation, then you may also have unintended consequences. All right? Okay, we're going to have to stop here. 75 minutes is always too short. Okay.